Shalom. Thank you, Saleit, for inviting me, and thank you for coming today. So I'd like to talk to you about some work we've been doing about mapping human influence on the biosphere in the 21st century. And I think in a land of Israel, which has a very, very long history, it's very important to appreciate that right now is a very important moment in history with an extraordinary population, both here in Israel as well as around the world, extraordinary levels of consumption and technology, and that these are having unprecedented impacts on the world around us, particularly the natural world, the other species that we share this world with. And it's really important to find ways to talk to all those stakeholders that Saleit mentioned about why this is so important and how it shapes our science and the way we think about conservation. I work at the Wildlife Conservation Society, which used to be the old New York Zoological Society at the Bronx Zoo in New York. Although I work at the zoo, we have field programs all around the world in 62 countries, mostly in the developing world, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we mostly work on large wildlife species like these, jaguars, bears, rhinos, elephants, tigers, and so forth. No matter where WCS works, though, we face a common set of challenges, including roads and infrastructure. This is a picture from the very northern part of Congo, the Republic of Congo in Central Africa. We work with resource extraction, whether that's logging here or sort of indigenous extraction in terms of fishing that's at the subsistence level. And we work with people like these. Although we're scientists and we work on wildlife conservation, all of our conservation work is working with people, because conservation is fundamentally a social activity. And these boys, they live at the village that's right on the edge of a very important national park in the Republic of Congo. And one of their biggest problems is the elephants that come into their field. And so this is a fence that WCS helped them built out of the wires that the logging company uses to pull the trees out of the forest to try and keep the elephants out of their manioc field. And of course, these boys are facing a lot of changes in their life. Never before has people this far down the road been exposed to people like me from America and the ideas that come from America, and that's changing the way they live and the way they think about themselves and their natural environment. And these things are true not only in Africa at the very end of the road, but also true in my country. This is Jackson Hole in Wyoming on the southern edge of the Tetons National Park. And this town is built right in the middle of a major wildlife corridor that doesn't work anymore, and so there's a reserve and they have to feed the elk just north of town. That these sort of infrastructure things are true all over the world. And so about 10 years ago, my colleagues and I wanted to try and make a map of what this looked like. So we reached out to publicly available data sets, global data sets at 1 kilometer resolution. This is a map of human population density in the world in 2000. There's no country boundaries, but yet you can still make out the shape of the land. This is a map of human settlements on planet Earth in 2000. This is a map of the roads and the railways and the rivers and the coastline. These are all means of access to the natural environment for people. This is a map of land use, just agriculture and urban land uses worldwide. And of course, this image, which is a little bit hard to see with our lights on, but this is how much light comes from planet Earth every night that satellites can measure. And so we added these data sets up and created this, the map of human influence, we call it, or the Human Influence Index. And it shows that human influence is first a gradient. I really want to emphasize this, that it's not black or white, although it's a grayscale map. It's actually a gradient of human influence, that it's small in some places and larger in other places and larger still in other places. If you analyze this map and ask which of the places that are not influenced, it's only 17% of the land surface. So 83% of the land surface, according to these data sets, is influenced by human beings already. And 98% of the places where it's possible to grow rice, wheat, and corn in the world are already influenced by people. So that means there's no other place to go. We actually are at all the places that are suitable for human life on Earth. There's no new place for us to go. And I think that's very important. It's certainly important in the North American context, where we kind of always think there's a valley to go, another place to go. But I think that's true for lots of places. It means this is a brand new sort of phenomenon on the face of planet Earth, that there isn't some new place that we can go to get more resources. Of course, this human influence is against the sort of map of potential ecosystems around the world. This is one version of that from the World Wildlife Fund. These are different kinds of ecosystems, and of course human influence means different things in different ecosystems. And so we can make a relative map. This is the map of human influence relativized within biomes, and we call this the human footprint map. So 100% is the most influenced place in each biome, and 0 is the least influenced place. And then you can put them all back together again. And that's also an important idea, which is that wildness is relative, right? So how much, where we are today is wild relative to the town just over there. And the Negev is wild compared to this whole region of Israel, and so forth and so on. That what's wild is relative to what you compare it to, whether that's ecosystems or countries or so forth. And because this data is at such resolution, we can zoom in on the map. This is Eastern North America and the central part of South America at the same scale, by the way, which is just to say that South America is a very large place. And if you zoom in, you can start to recognize the geography that everybody knows. This is the geography of where I live in New York City, and these roads all have names. That's Boston up there. This is the New York City watershed here, and the Adirondack Park. So you can actually see this map of human influence. And the third point I'd like to make, not only do we see a gradient of human influence, and not only is wildness a relative concept, but in fact, all these places have nature, right? We can think of human influence as a constraint that's laid on top of nature. So, which means that in this part of the world, nature is mixed temperate broadleaf forest, but in New York City, the mixed temperate broadleaf forest looks like this. And in the Hudson River Valley, it looks like this. And up in the Adirondack Mountains, it looks like this. All the same biome type, only varying in their level of human influence. Some people say nature doesn't exist in New York City, but in fact it does exist in New York City. It's just tightly constrained by human infrastructure. And we can do this for Africa. This is Nairobi, and the road going down to Mombasa and up to Kampala. This is what the orange areas, the grazed areas outside Nairobi look like, or the Masai Mara, or in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and the palm plantations, and Tamanagara. You can take these maps then and find what are the relatively wildest places that are objects of conservation interest, because these are places where you're more likely to find all the species of interest and at levels where they're fully interacting with each other across the sort of diversity of nature that we have in the world. And you can zoom in on these maps. This is Central Africa again, and those protected areas in the northern part of Congo, that's where we started the talk. And you can actually locate places across the landscape that are more likely to have the things that we want to conserve and that are going to be cheaper to conserve because there's less people, less infrastructure, less conflict. Oops. So this is Mike Fay's famous journey on the megatransect through the wildest parts of Africa. We can refine this for Israel, and this is the work of Dr. Noam Levine. This is our human footprint map for Israel, but he made a map that looks at distance from built-up areas in Israel, and of course it's hard to get very far from built-up structures in Israel, except down in the Negev. And then this landscape continuity analysis, which is, if you like, a refinement of regional scale. And there's been a lot of work in doing this in North America, in Israel, in Central America, and in other places, trying to use higher precision data to get a more refined view of the landscape. And we can even zoom in and see our neighborhood where we are today, right? And use, at any scale, use this sort of mapping approach to try and think about how human beings are influencing the landscape and therefore how conservation can be deployed. Recently, we've been working on how to allocate human footprint based on the economics of various countries. So by using the import and export statistics. So how much, this is the map for the United States for my country. And so how much of US economic consumption is satisfied from within the United States, and how much is it satisfied from other parts of the world, as a way of trying to think about responsibility for conservation in different parts of the world. Because we have this globalized economy, of course, what's going on in the United States doesn't just influence the United States, but influences many other places. We can do this too for Israel. This is using the same color scheme, which on that, if you do that sort of equivalent, of course, Israel's impact on the whole world is much less, except in Israel. But if we stretch the color scheme so we can see Israel's impact a little bit better, and then zoom in, you can actually see the patterns of Israeli trade with Armenia and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Turkey and Belgium and the Netherlands and so forth and so on. And do it in a quantitative way. We're actually allocating the levels of human influence based on economic statistics. About 67% of Israeli economic consumption is satisfied from within Israel, and 33% is satisfied from other places. You can put this human footprint map together with maps of human influence in the sea, and this is what it looks like. So this is one depiction of how human beings are influencing the world today. The color scheme's a little bit different to try and make the oceans and the land go together. But you can see it's quite dramatic. In fact, human influence on land is 83%, like I said, and it's actually even higher in the sea, even though the seas are 70% of the total area on Earth. And where is this all coming from? Well, from people, right? You know, there's 6.7 billion people on the face of the Earth today, the largest population in the history of humanity, and the United Nations predicts that the world population may top out at 8 to 10 billion over the course of the next 100 years. So within many of our lifetimes, right? It means that our generation is so critical to this situation about conservation because these things are peaking, hopefully peaking in the course of our lifetimes. There's also consumption, whether it's in Manhattan or in the slums of Nairobi. And we have this immense but unequal rates of consumption worldwide, both within countries, but of course across countries. That's so important. And the whole world wants to consume the way I get to consume in New York City, right? And it's not clear that there are resources that can support that kind of consumption. It's also not clear that people in New York City are willing to give up much of their consumption in order to allow other people to consume. And that creates enormous social friction and tension and politics that complicates greatly our work as conservationists. And finally, technology. You know, the capacity to actually, this is an image from southern Brazil, to take down rainforests on such a massive scale. We have these undreamt of technological advantages that are both positive and negatives in terms of how we think about conservation and what we're going to do going forward. And of course, Paul Ehrlich said a long time ago that population times consumption times technology is the human footprint. That is our mark on the face of the planet. And as any of these goes up, it multiplies across the other. So that if we zoom in on Europe, this is what the map looks like, or Eastern North America, where I'm from, or thinking about the Eastern Mediterranean. So how are human beings exceptional? How are we not exceptional? You know, people are not different from other species in that our population grows until limited by resources, right? I mean, that seems to be the way of the world, that just like any other population, whether it's birds or plants, it's trying to get as large as it can. We compete with other species as part of that. We compete both directly and indirectly in that sort of ecological way. And we take the resources we need from the world, taking it first because we need it, and then thinking secondarily about the consequences. And this is true for every other species of organism on the face of the planet. If human beings are exceptional, it's because we can talk to each other, right? We can actually have meetings like this and discuss what we're going to do about conservation. We can make choices in a way that other species can't. We can make conscious choices. And we are conscious of both the past and the future. We see ourselves in a long-term trajectory. So if people have been living in Israel for 8,000 years, 10,000 years, how are the decisions today facilitating people 10,000 years from now still living in this country? Or are we closing off the possibilities for people to live here 10,000 years now? And those same questions are true for North America and for the entire world. You know, how are we going to plan over the long term for humanity's presence on this planet? A presence that's supported so much by the natural systems of the planet, that we are not species that live outside of nature, but in fact are part of and connected to nature. What's extraordinary is our population and our influence, and perhaps our capacity to make different choices. So what are we going to do? Well, science-based conservation offers some of the answers, right? It's just one of the many answers, and obviously there's a lot to be done in the social realm, and the political realm, and the economic realm, as well as in the scientific realm, to answer what are we going to do. In fact, I would say that conservation biology as a discipline has been quite successful in diagnosing the problem and suggesting ways to address the problem in many ways. There's still work to be done, particularly at local scales. For me, my attention is turning to why haven't we done it already, right? Given the sort of facts I'm talking about, and these are not facts that you need to study years and years in school to realize. These are things that we can actually see just by walking around in your daily world and sort of thinking about what the consequences are for it. And the question is, science-based conservation have a role in this? And in some ways, I think, although you can use the human footprint and these sort of techniques as conservation planning tools and help us conserve better, in some ways, I think what's more important is using these tools as ways of communicating to people about why it's important. And if you actually take on board this thinking about the human footprint and how dramatic it actually is quite difficult to think. And so in closing, I asked my son if he would help me talk about some of the psychological difficulties in communicating these things. Because I think if we're talking not just to conservationists and other scientists, but if we're talking to the general public, there's a lot of denial out there, right? People just, they don't know how to deal with this until they just deny that it's true. And you can see this in the climate change debate. You can see it in conversations about endangered species. It just doesn't, I'm just going to deny that it's happening because it's so difficult for me to take in. Some people, of course, get very depressed, and there is a thread of sort of manic depression that runs through conservation, for better or for worse. Some people get very, very angry, and particularly people on the environmental advocacy side get very, very angry and blame other people about what's going on. And that's their response, right? Which is you can certainly understand why people have that response, but it's not always the most helpful response, I think. I think where most of the general public is in distraction. I wonder what's on television tonight. Just, this is all too big and I can't think about it, so I'm just going to take care of what my family and what I need and get to work, and I'll let somebody else worry about this. I'll basically kick the can, as we say in America, down the road to future generations, to other places, to outside my neighborhood. And of course there's transference, which we might call sticking it to the man, which is to say, it's not my fault, it's your fault, it's somebody else's fault, it's the United States' fault, or it's the developing world's fault, it's Israel's fault, it's not Israel's, it's somebody else's fault, it's big business, it's the government, there's a million people to blame. But of course, that's what's so complicated about it, is we're all are part of the story, right? We all are implicit in it. And yet, if any one of us became a saint and did exactly the right thing, it wouldn't make any difference on the human footprint. You wouldn't even be able to see it. So what we need to get to is acceptance, right? Where we accept a problem for what it is, where we plan for the future, and I mean a long-term future. A future that allows us all, not just our kids, but our kids' kids, and our kids' kids, and our kids' kids, a long-term future for human beings and all the rest of the species on Earth, where we transform negative feelings into positive choices. And I hope that through this workshop that we can perform some of that hard work, some of that difficult work, and therefore solve the problem, what I think is the greatest problem facing humanity today. Thank you very much.
I'm interested in, I agree with you that we have to accept the problem, but how? Is it okay to go through a process of being angry first and blaming others and transferring it, and then going, right, now, how do we actually physically get to a state that when accepting the problem is going to solve the problem?
Right, well I think, yeah, so the question is, do we need to move through a series of phases, anger and depression and so forth, to be able to get to a point where we can accept the problem, and then what are we going to do? And in fact, I kind of think that's where we're at, right? That there is these huge psychological barriers to actually thinking about, how are we going to deal with what's going on in the world, right? And these come up immediately. If you start to talk to people about driving their car, right? You immediately, I can't give up my car, even though we all realize that each of us driving our car is contributing to climate change, contributing to the infrastructure that's destroying that is literally destroying nature, that drives so many of our problems, and yet we don't know how to think about it. And I think we don't know how to think about it because of these sort of psychological difficulties. And I'm not a psychologist, unfortunately, but there's a very interesting thread of conservation psychology that is starting to work on these problems. for me, what I'm trying to do is make the kind of science that helps people see the world the way I see it. So as a world with this huge natural potential, this huge abundance and beauty and aesthetics, and something that was important to humanity since the very beginning of humanity. And to see how endangered that world is, and therefore help people pass through to the point where they can realize, this is a very, very important time. How can we try and deal with it? How can we try and approach it? And then the approaches to conservation, I think, have to come at all sorts of scales. There are the global problems, but there are the local actions, and then all of the sort of intermediary groups. And ironically, I kind of think, maybe it's just the way I think about the world, but the more and more I study conservation, the less I think it's actually a biological problem, and the more I think it's a social and economic and political problem. And then I'm sure we'll have some chances to discuss that.
Questions? Any other questions? I had a question.
Okay.
You drew the maps of the last of the wild and the human footprint. What were they used for?
Yep.
For papers?
So I mentioned at the beginning that I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and we have about a $60 million budget that we invest into global conservation. And one of the ways that we pick where to invest is by using the last of the wild to try and think about where the wildest places are. So we use it that way. It's also been used in a number of analyses to try and think a sort of generic threat. We've used it to try and map where tigers are, for example, or where they're not. It's been used to study the relationship between biodiversity in Africa. How much is the human footprint a predictor of biodiversity or not? It's been used in studies of range collapse for species. And it's been used as an education tool. So if I had a little bit more time, I would bring my computer up here with the GIS, and we would zoom in to where we are today, and then zoom back out. And that's remarkably compelling to people, to my mom, right? When I showed her that we could zoom into her neighborhood and then zoom out, that helps people see the world in a new way, to sort of contextualize the relationship in a new way. Like as I mentioned yesterday, I think in much the way that the telescope, helped us sort of see our place in the galaxy 500 years ago, right? That you didn't know that there were all these stars that now you can see through the telescope. And that's important not just for the stars that you counted and the scientific information, but thinking about yourself as a little planet in a large galaxy. Science has this capacity to reveal new things about the world we live in, and that have been here all the time we were just unaware of, to make the invisible visible. And I think that that's a really important contribution that science can make as we think about the dilemmas that we face in terms of conservation.